it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Excuse me. Thank you for the water. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, thank you very much, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish all were as myself, I am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Amen. So Paul is moving away from this area of sexual immorality, but it's closely linked. He wanted to address those areas of sexual immorality. He saw them as major problems happening in the church, and now he's addressing an area where they had written about. They were asking them questions about this situation. You notice now, he says in verse 7, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So they had written about abstinence from sex in marriage. It was happening because of the Greek dualism philosophy and thought was going on. The other extreme to the sexual immorality that people were doing was that people were being told that in their marriages that they must abstain from sexual relations because this is the holy thing to do and the spiritual thing to do. And so this is what they were doing, abstaining from sex within the context of marriage. And Paul is seeking to address this area. And so he gives 5 principles here. I've seen 5 principles in marriage. He opens up, doesn't he, by saying it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Paul was single and he lived a celibate life, and he says that is good. A person who is not married can give their attention solely and being solely devoted to God, whereas a person who is married needs to show that devotion to their partner, their husband or their wife. And so they're distracted with those things, whereas somebody who's single can give themselves solely to the work of God and be married to God in a sense. But Paul is saying that the married those that are married should not refrain from sexual relations. Because it acts as a preventative principle in marriage. It's a preventative principle. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. A single person can be more devoted to the Lord, and Paul states that in verse 28 of chapter 7. He says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if the betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Whereas a single person, verses 32 to 33, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. It's not less being married than being single. Marriage is a gift given from God. But Paul is saying is that a married person has a responsibility for his wife and the wife for her husband, and so they'll be anxious about those things and worldly things. Whereas a person who is not married can be solely sold out and devoted to the work of the Lord. It's got no pressures coming from the other half, as it were, in that marriage. So marriage works as a preventative principle because it is an arena for sexual relations and prevents one falling into sexual immorality. Verse 5 of chapter 7, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time that you may devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So when a healthy sexual relationship in a marriage is happening, it avoids the temptation of falling into sexual immorality. And so it's a preventative principle in marriage. You see, these Christians were married to non-Christians or to Christians, and they were being told to refrain from sex completely, called to live an ascetic lifestyle, even after being married, and that is completely wrong. And he says this isn't right. Sex in marriage is healthy and it is good, both for men and women. It acts as that preventative from committing adultery and from the devil's schemes to entice one or the other away from holiness. I mean, there's great advice, isn't there, in Proverbs chapter 5, where a father gives to his young son, chapter 5, my son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Here it's talking about adultery, of going off with a woman, with a prostitute. Of course, it can go both ways. A man can tempt a woman too. But in this case, we know in King David was such a case. But here it's speaking of a woman's tempting the man when a man needs to stay in his marriage context in regard to sex. Verses 15 to 19 of chapter 5. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Wow, there's the talk of the Bible. I suppose sex is sort of a thing Christians will talk about something, taboo, isn't it? Sort of subject. But here the Bible is quite clear. Stay with the woman of your youth. Delight in one another. And the warning of falling, going to another system, and the tragic circumstances which will result from it. Look, we see that in verses 22 of chapter 5. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. No, chapter 5, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. For the man's ways, verse 21, are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly he is led astray. Of course, fornication, sexual immorality, Paul has already touched upon, and they will be judged. And there are consequences of our misdemeanours, as it were. And so we should stay within marriage, acts as a preventative measure. Infidelity, of course, can happen to anybody, even Christians. Here are a few tips for readers to an affair-proof their marriage. I call them the 4 Ps. Firstly, be protective of your marriage. Avoid risky situations such as long lunches with a co-worker or drinks for 2 after work. Most people don't plan to be unfaithful. It just happens. Be positive. Look for what is right in your spouse and tell him or her daily. People who have love affairs are often looking for appreciation and affirmation. Thirdly, be polite. Always talk to your spouse with respect. Be careful what you say to each other and how you say it. Show courtesy and caring in the way you treat one another. Fourthly, be playful. Make fun. Make fun sex and humour a mainstay in your marriage. Schedule time to play with one another and have a date night at least once a week. Marriages can and do survive affairs, and many become stronger having weathered the storm, but not without pain and a genuine desire to recommit. So that's the preventative principle. Secondly, we see the exclusivity principle in marriage. It's not good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Here we see the exclusivity, don't we? A heterosexual monogamous marriage between one man and one woman is the only correct context whereby one can truly enjoy a loving, intimate sexual relationship with one another under God, under his blessing. This rules out a man and a man, it rules out a woman and a woman. Each man is to have his own wife and each woman his own husband. This is what the Bible teaches here. This, of course, contradicts English law to this date, which is not exclusively between one man and one woman. From the 29th of March, same-sex couples will get married in loving relationships. They will be legally able to marry. The English dictionaries have already changed their definition of marriage. They added a formal union between partners of the same sex. So in society we see that marriage is no longer exclusive to man and woman, as under God's law. It seeks to be all-inclusive, encompassing, no doubt, as a result of the sexual revolution, with its increases of promiscuity, sexual immorality, activity outside of marriage, which marriage prevents, of course. All of which has brought a breakdown of marriage, divorce, fornication, cohabitation. Sex is seen as something not exclusive to marriage between a man and a woman, but something entered into at the earliest ages with whoever you please. And it seems that the main cravat for it is that you love one another. And that's good. The main cravat is we're in a loving relationship. And that might be true. There might be a loving relationship, but marriage exclusively is not about two people being in a loving relationship. There's so much more under God, the exclusivity of marriage, than just a loving relationship. And we'll look at that. Of course, as churches, we're protected, aren't we, from changes being further imposed. And people outside the Anglican fraternal have been given the option of opting into the divergence of marriage in society that we see. But it all opens up for the church a rabbit warren of holes that you will find many professing Christians getting lost down, maybe even some people in this building, with church liberalism conforming to culture, a steady increase of prominent leaders, even in the Baptist denomination itself. Steve Chalk has come out openly supporting gay marriage. I perceive whole denominations conforming. Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans. I see whole denominations. There's going to be a great battle in this area of marriage. And those who hold a traditional Christian view of traditional marriage will be looked upon as intolerant radicals. So, the common denominator for marriage is not simply being all-inclusive, an all-loving relationship between two people. That might be the case, and there'll be genuine, loving, lifelong, committed, same-sex marriages. Not denying that, and there will be. But biblical marriage is more than just an inclusive or loving relationship between two people, whatever gender. Firstly, it tells us that man was meant for woman and man and woman. And so it's exclusively marriage was established for man and woman. And it's seen as that exclusive relationship. And we see that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 to 28. We see that God gives Adam and Eve some directives there. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said then, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish and the birds of the heavens and the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. We see there that also not only were they exclusive for man and woman, but the exclusivity was to go forth and multiply, to be fruitful, to procreate, to have children and children and children. And the context, the exclusivity of marriage between a man and a woman is that context where children are born, isn't it? Between a man and a woman. In any other context, it doesn't take place. But not only that is fruitful, but also in Genesis 2:24 we see that marriage of one man and one woman is a creation ordinance, which is not only physical but also deeply physical, deeply spiritual. It tells us that the woman was taken from the side of man, from his inner being, and the man would leave his father and mother, and he shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. In marriage, or when you bond yourself to somebody, there is a deep spiritual picture. There's a spiritual bonding that is going on. Not just the physical, the sexual, but there's a deep spiritual bonding, and it is a picture of Christ and his relationship with the church. We see that in Ephesians chapter 5. Verses 31 to 32, that profound union. So it's exclusivity of giving oneself wholeheartedly till death do you part to that one person, a man and a wife, that we might go forth and multiply. And it is a picture of Christ and his church, a beautiful bride. The story of a bride who once shared, when we date, we start giving gifts like flowers or chocolates. When we became engaged, we gave special things, a diamond and very personal things. The most personal gift that I can ever give is I have nothing more precious to give, and as a result of my marriage today, I want to give my husband the best that I have, my whole self, as completely as I can, exclusively to him. That's so true, isn't it? We are giving one another to ourselves in the context of marriage exclusively to one another. And then there's the mutuality principle here in verses 3 to 4. The husband should give to his wife conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So they have a mutual responsibility here for each other's needs. And that is the picture of Christ. He didn't consider his own needs, he considered the needs of others. And in marriage is a picture of considering one another. We consider each other's needs. We put other people's needs, the other person's needs, before our needs. And that's very difficult when we come from a singleness, because when we're single, we're always thinking about our own needs. And often, when marriages break up and disintegrate in one thing or another, it's because we're thinking that we've still got that mentality. We're thinking about our own needs when we should be thinking about the other person's needs. And so marriage is where we think about each other's needs. We give them priority over our own needs. And that's so counterculture. It's so counter even our own minds. Even as Christians, it's something that we have to deliberately tell ourselves to do. Because we're so pre-programmed as human beings for our own needs, and not putting the needs of the other before our own. That's not saying that we're doormats. Notice here, look, it's a time mutually agreed. It's mutuality. One has authority over each other's bodies. It's not that one is a dictator and the other is the slave. She is as much as the mistress of his person as he is the master of hers. There's that equality there. They have the mutual responsibility and privilege to consider one another's sexual needs. So newly married couples often find this whole area difficult, as I've already said. But there is this mutual responsibility for one another. You know, we see it in the marriage ceremony, don't we? At the heart of any marriage ceremony and marriage itself is this giving oneself away. Who gives this woman away this day? You know, sort of thing. It's the father of the bride comes. And this is what we do. And then there's the vows, isn't there, to each other. The vow, all that I am, I give to you. And all that I have, I share with you within the love of God. This mutuality of sharing, of loving, of giving oneself to the other. Any other way, it's just a marriage is not going to work. It's going to be very difficult. The essence of love is of self-giving, of sacrifice, isn't it? It's a doing thing. It's something to be done. Love is not something we say. Love is not a feeling that we have. Love is not great sex. Love is of giving oneself for the other. And at the sexual level, this is reaffirmed and deepened where this oneness comes into being. So it's the mutuality principle, the exclusivity principle, the preventative principle, and then the abstinence principle, verses 5 to 6. Do not deprive one another, except by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together so that Satan may not tempt you because of lack of self-control. Now, Paul here gives the only reason for the refusal of conjugal rights for one another, because they're called not to deprive one another. There are only two restrictions here, which we are mutually entitled to abstain. One by mutual agreement, verse 5, and that for a limited time. And two, for holy purposes, that we might devote ourselves together as a couple to prayer, to greater things, to be devoted to prayer. If we resist one another, our rights, our sexual rights, outside of these mutually agreed purposes, we may find ourselves feeling deprived, filled with resentment, frustrated with the other. We may even find ourselves moving away from the Lord, a cause for unhappiness in marriage, and even a temptation to adultery, to go elsewhere, because one has imposed their own will upon the matter without a unilateral, mutual consent. It may seem all very spiritual to abstain from sexual activity in marriage, as in the case at Corinth, because of the asceticism. But Paul sees this as dangerous, to deprive one another, to put restrictions completely, to have no sex at all. They should never have been married. He says, no, it should be mutually agreed for a limited time. If not, problems will lay ahead, because verse 5, Satan may well tempt you because of a lack of self-control. The sex drive in men and women is strong. And marriage is the context for the fulfillment of that. Remember, we war against Satan, the world, and the flesh, our own flesh, the sinful desires. So this is a concession. This is what Paul is saying in verse 6. It's not a command. It's not a command, it's a concession. He has apostolic authority, but it's not a command. He's not making a straitjacket, saying this is the way, these are the hoops, you must jump through this to refrain from sex in order of prayer. He says we've got a choice in the matter. We may refrain from sexual relations for short periods of time in order to pray together, but we have a choice. Sexual relationship in a marriage keeps a marriage healthy, balanced, and together. It keeps temptation at bay from both parties. But at a time, it might be helpful and mutually beneficial and a spiritual blessing to refrain and to pray and to draw close to God together. And then finally, the gift principle in marriage. Marriage is a gift from God, a charisma gift. I wish that all were as I myself am, single, devote myself and work to God, but each has his own gift from God, one of the one kind and one of another. Marriage is a gift from God. The Bible says in Genesis, it's not good that man should be alone. And so he gave Adam an helper to come alongside, to help and support. And marriage is a gift from God, as is singleness is a gift from God, and is to be enjoyed with God. A life fully devoted to the Lord. Whereas one who is married has bounds and ties to that marriage and commitment to that loving relationship. So whether we're married or single today, we can celebrate the gifts that God has given you at this moment. And you know, whether you're single and you're thinking, why have I never got married? Just rest in the will and the sovereign purposes of God of where you are right now. And celebrate that marriage that you have with the Lord. And who knows the future, God may lead you into a relationship with a lifelong partner. And if we are married, let's not neglect one another. Let's mutually love one another and be responsible for one another. Let us celebrate the gift of marriage. Let us guard our marriages against the temptations that we have as human beings to go outside of the context of our marriage. Let's guard our marriages. Let's love our wives. Let's love our husbands. And let's walk with our Lord together. Amen.
Amen.